Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to. This is the third question and answer session that we are hosting this term. I hope that all of you were able to see Daniele Colombaroli's excellent lecture last week on wildfires. I'm delighted that Daniele has been able to join us this evening for this live question and answer. Daniele, you're very welcome, and thank you for last week's lecture.
Hi everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us. So as I say, this is the third session that we are running this term, and we have one more to go after this, and the details of that I will share with you at the end of this session. So Daniele, would you like to perhaps introduce yourself for the benefit of the audience at home? Perhaps those people who did see your lecture last week, but also for those who weren't able to catch it.
Yeah, so I'm a physical geography here in Royal Holloway Department of Geography, and I'm interested in environmental changes, and some of the most pressing questions that I have in my research is how the information from past ecosystems can tell us about future changes in biomes and ecosystems. So this is a kind of question that has driven me my research interest in the last years, especially, and in particular, one of the topics that has been of great interest for me is typically wildfires and their effects on vegetation structure and composition. And so this is why I'm very much interested in this topic here.
Daniele, can I just ask, how do you get into wildfires? So as a geographer, I know that geography is a wide and diverse subject. How did you particularly get into wildfires as your area of interest?
Well, this for several reasons. One of the most important ones, I think, is the growing importance of wildfires as we hear today, for example, in the media. So wildfires are catching a lot of media attention in the last years, but also overall in the last 10 years, because we heard this in the media, right? Extreme wildfire events that are posing great risks, not only on natural resources, but also on infrastructure generally. So there is this perception that wildfires are really at the top of risk. And so this is one of the points that for me were very much attracting. So I started asking myself, what is it causing all these increasing wildfires that we see today? This is very much a geographical question, because it implies to look at different spaces, different ecosystems, but also the time perspective here is very important. But I would say that is also a topic that is touching many other disciplines. For example, ecology. The ecological component in the understanding of wildfires is very important too. And it's also touching other disciplines like social sciences, for example. How we deal with wildfire, what are the consequences of having more and more wildfire events for communities. So there is a full range of topics here that are around this big theme of environmental changes and environmental hazards that can be tackled by many more disciplines. And I like this perspective, right, to have a bit of a touch from different angles. I think this makes our life as geographer also very much interesting and every time kind of new in this.
Absolutely. When I was watching your talk, which I have to say I hugely enjoyed, because I didn't really know enough about wildfires, to be perfectly honest, even though I live quite close to here at Royal Holloway, where of course we have some huge areas of lowland heath, which is very fire prone. So I really enjoyed your talk, because for me it really did bring together the human and the physical parts of geography that are so often kept apart, but you brought them together so nicely. So can I just maybe invite you just to kind of go, just to maybe pull a few highlights of your talk from last week together, just to kind of slightly review in a couple of minutes, if you can, some of the key highlights. Then we'll go on and I'll start asking you some of the questions that I've been gathering over the past week.
Yeah, so basically I started highlighting this important ecosystem process that today is very much in the media. So fire is becoming an issue not only for natural resources but very much also for people. So it's very much in the attention. It is very important today, but also it will be a growing issue in the future. So this was another aspect of my talk. So a bit the understanding that we are going under more higher temperature, so the topic of global and climatic changes, it's really very much related to this. So actually higher temperature in many ecosystems will translate into more and more fires. So today, but also in light of future events. But it's not only climate here which plays an important role, it's also human activity. In terms of deforestation, converting forest into croplands. So this is a big concern for today ecosystem sustainability. And we had many examples in the last year, for example, related to Brazil, to the Amazon rainforest, where many areas are being converted from forest to open grasslands or croplands. So the exploitation components here is very important, is very relevant, which is adding a lot of concern in the way we want to manage future natural resources. So it's a big concern here. Then another point that I wanted to highlight in my talk, which is a bit in contrast with this perception of fire as a bad component, an enemy of ecosystem. So my second point was quite going the opposite direction, and is coming from the understanding that fire is also a natural process. It has always been here on Earth before us, before modern humans started roaming into the landscape. So it's pretty much a natural process. So the message here is probably that we don't want to tame fire, but it's more about coexisting with fire, coexisting with the ecological processes and natural resources that have always been here on Earth before us. So I think it's also another important and interesting take-home message. And probably the last point that I wanted to touch, and is very interesting for me, is that there are many examples of adaptation to fire. For example, if we look into plants, there are many examples of species that co-evolved, so evolved together with fire, and developed special adaptations to fire. So I brought, for example, the example of the lodgepole pine, this beautiful tree which is able to cope with fire, which has cones that opens just after a fire. So actually it's the fire that releases the seeds. Without fire as a natural component in those ecosystems, you won't have those species also thriving in the ecosystems.
Daniele, thank you. That's a brilliant summary of the lecture, and it's just a reminder of the extraordinary tour that you took us on in terms of natural and, well, when I say natural, I'm not even sure if you can necessarily separate humans from nature now, but certainly anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic reasons for fire, the impact of climate change and other human activity. I'm really intrigued, and I was going to ask you about fire adaptation as well. So you've perfectly set up the Q&A that's to follow. And what I'd say to anybody watching at home, please do feel free to post a comment in the chat on the side there, and I will and I'm looking at that all the time, and I can put that to Daniele. So there was so much in your talk that really struck me as fascinating. First of all, fires and why they're happening. And you had a really interesting graph to show that not only are fires happening, but they're happening at what seems to be greater frequency than we have seen in perhaps recent human experience, but not necessarily more than we've seen in the past from past records. Can you maybe just talk us through something about the why and the where of fire? So what is the kind of the contemporary geography of pyrogeographies? Where are you seeing a rise in fires happening most often at the moment?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There was recently an article on the Guardian, trying to present a story about the last trends on biomass burning across ecosystems in the last 10 years. And I think here is the general understanding here, looking at all those fire records coming from satellites, but also from natural archives, is that generally we see an interesting contrasting trend, which is on one side you have a general decrease in area burned. So the total area of burning is decreasing in the last years. And this is partly due to the activity of like agriculture, which is removing completely fuel on ecosystem. It's bringing a kind of fire exclusion in the system. But on the other end, and this is very much related to those big catastrophic fire events that we have been reading in the news, for example, in Amazon, but also in Congo, in Portugal a few years ago, in the Pacific Northwest, so California, but also a bit higher up, we heard a lot about devastating fires in Oregon, much more than previous year. So this is going towards a different pattern. So we have more catastrophic fires in forests and in areas that have not been experiencing very much of those catastrophic events. So there is a lot of going on, and this complexity will raise important issues, I believe, in the near future on how we manage ecosystems and how we mitigate the effect of wildfires on Earth.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, you only need to open your newspaper on a daily basis to be reading almost, about another fire happening. And of course, Australia, a couple of years ago, they had the devastating fires in Victoria and New South Wales. So what links for us Australia, Portugal, Congo, the Pacific Northwest of Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California? Is there a commonality in all of those fire incidences, or are they being driven by perhaps climate change generally, but climate change is driving different processes in each of those places? It's leading to wildfire.
Yeah, well, certainly the rising temperature that we are experiencing in the last decade and also in the future, these are playing an important part. So there are areas of the world where actually an increase in temperature is significantly contributing to the likelihood to have a devastating fire. For example, also lengthening of the dry season in certain areas is very important, because this is really bringing in the ignition probability to have more and more wildfires. But I wouldn't say that this is the only important factor. And I would say the other important variable here is related to land use changes.
Okay.
So the way people are expanding the area exploitation areas, so areas that were before untouched, has been converted to, for example, crops, or they are completely forests that are completely removed for example, replanting. Think about, for example, palm oil in some tropical settings. It's gonna be a significant problem in the future because we are really changing the ecosystems. So we are going really outside of this natural variability that we see in the historical and prehistorical record. So there are a lot of important changes, pervasive changes in most of world's area, which will bring more and more fires in the future.
Okay, Daniele, thank you. That's really helpful. So on one hand, we've got global climate change, which is leading to increased temperatures and the lengthening of the dry season in particular places. But then we've also got local environmental events as well. So the removal of particular kind of the deforestation, but also particular kind of crops as well. So there's a kind of combination of things that are happening in some of these key sites that we need to be aware of. I mean, I also remember, was it last year or the year before, there were even quite extensive wildfires in the UK near Manchester, up on some of the moorland. Is that being driven by decreased precipitation, the drying out of land that had traditionally been wetter than it has been in the past?
So that's an interesting example what you mentioned, because here in the UK we normally perceive the landscape as very much under more humid conditions. So fire is something that is outside of the system, and when we see it, we tend to refer it to just human impact. But it's not always the case. I mean, fire has been also here during, for example, past changes where we have drier conditions. But obviously here the management can also play a difference. And where, for example, people are allowed to burn, and this is like a traditional practice, when this is coupled to anomalous climatic conditions, those fires can easily escape, and then it's very difficult to keep them. So it's very much a complex situation where we have fires also, for example, affecting peatlands. Peatlands are important source of carbon stock, and so wildfires are really affecting different properties of ecosystems.
Now, Daniele, as you probably know from my accent, I'm from Scotland originally, and of course, up on the high moorlands of Scotland, fire is regularly used as a land management practice. So what's happening there? Why do large landowners serially burn large swathes of heather? And I mean that's kind of part of a managed fire relationship between humans and fire in the landscape.
I think you're raising also a question about the conflicts between traditional practices and also what we are observing and trying to preserve in ecosystems. So what I know actually is that obviously this has been used very much as a traditional practice to maintain also heathlands, which is also true, but also for grouse hunting, I guess. So this is it's something that local people want to maintain, but this always has been done under certain climatic regimes, under certain climatic conditions. When you go outside of those boundaries, then you risk to amplify the effects of those disturbance regimes into ecosystems. So it's very difficult to say whether it's a bad or good practice, because it depends what you have in mind as a target, right?
Yeah.
What you want to achieve. But it's interesting because those contrasts are raising a lot of debates in the government, for example, on how to limit the spread of those severe events in the future.
Daniele, thank you. And as I asked my question about Scotland, one of our followers asked a very similar question in relation to North Yorkshire, and he was asking, should areas like the North Yorkshire Moors have prescribed burns to support land management? So you've answered that question perfectly, and it relates to what do humans want to achieve with the landscape. It's about the purpose of that land management tactic or strategy.
Yeah, I think the question on prescribed burning is very appropriate, in the sense that this is raising a lot of debates, not only in the UK but also in other countries. Think about the US, where prescribed burning have been used in many ecosystems, and with the huge costs actually. So it's important here to distinguish between costs and benefits. And yeah, there is not a straightforward question on this, but usually the restoration of ecosystem depends a bit on the targets, right? What you want to restore, whether you want to keep an ecosystem that has those, let's say, anthropogenic legacies. So those are, let's say, artifacts of human presence, which are not only from today's, but goes back many millennia. And this sometimes contrasts with a kind of perception of the landscapes, which is more, let's say, semi-natural, so less driven by human initiative, let's say.
And of course, Daniele, you and I well know, because we work at Royal Holloway, we're really close to one of the largest areas of lowland heath anywhere in Europe. Chobham Common is just down the road from us. And I had no idea about lowland heathland before I moved to this area. But of course, that's tens of thousands of years old, from my understanding, in terms of its legacy, and it's a very early example of humans clearing the land in order to use it for a particular kind of agriculture. But it's now become part of the heritage of Southeast England, and so even though it is in theory it's unnatural, it's also something that's now considered desirable. It's entered the kind of the heritage landscape bracket. It's kind of a curious way that fire, of course, is a really important way of managing that land, has become kind of naturalized.
Yeah, I think this is part of a kind of paradox, right? So if you let the nature go in those ecosystems, nature will take its course. Those areas will likely disappear. So without spending any money, you would have a kind of natural conditions, with the trees, with the growing trees, and the disappearance of many of those heathlands areas, at least in some part. But if you wanted to maintain those ecosystems that are more like related to a kind of cultural legacy, in that case, you need to invest money. So I found this a kind of interesting paradox, where usually you tend to think that to preserve natural ecosystems you need to invest money and resources, which is true in many other parts. But there are also those cases which are very complex to disentangle, right? Because they require really an understanding of what is it really natural, and which are instead the legacies and heritage, and which are their values, and why we should preserve them.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's so interesting because it's very difficult to unpick the human and the natural, and so often, aren't we? The contemporary agendas seem to be about trying to restore nature. A lot of the debate here is actually about how you should maintain artificiality, or at least that human impact. Now, Daniele, thank you so much for that. Now, listen, I know that one of the things that occupies the minds of teachers and students alike is the issue of the carbon cycle. And I wondered, how can you bring the carbon cycle into relationship with the story of wildfires?
Yeah, so actually, disturbance regimes in general. So they contribute to this carbon cycling between terrestrial and also the atmosphere. The easiest way to think about it is about stocks and sources. Okay, so you have forest which play the stock, so they have carbon in it, and then there are a series of processes which transfer the carbon from those stocks to the atmosphere, right? And then they cycle again. Now the problem that I've been mentioned before is that when we are going in a future that will have more wildfires, at least in temperate regions, for example, you are turning forest from stock to sources. So before they have this important role of keeping carbon in their organic tissues. But now you are converting them into a source. And so this is an example of how dynamic is the carbon cycle, how complex is also, and this requires very much an understanding of the spatial distribution of carbon stocks, but also its temporal changes, so the changes through times. So a typical question that we ask as a physical geography first, when we combine the spatial but also the temporal perspective. I think the carbon stocks, the carbon cycle is one of those examples where you want to appreciate the dynamic nature of those complex natural cycles and processes.
Okay. So think about stocks and sources. So trees, forests, of course, contain all of that carbon in their tissues, as you say. These processes then ultimately release that carbon back into the atmosphere, and of course, forests then recapture that over.
Then obviously these go back. There are some scientists who think that if you have more and more carbon in the atmosphere, then you have more likelihood that this will be captured by vegetation. So there are interesting studies trying to understand whether some plant species in particular are more helpful in recapturing this carbon. In any case, I will not say that this is like an excuse not to think about the effects that humans are having on the landscape. We are paying a huge toll in terms of ecosystems and species that we are losing today. And if no action is done today, we may pay a lot of consequence in the future in terms of all species that may disappear, but also the value of forests.
Thanks, Daniele. Daniele, we've actually had another question while you were answering that one that's come in from Rob. Can I just put this to you? So, as you probably remember, during the 2020 California wildfires, President Trump was very quick to speak about those wildfires, and he blamed poor forest management on those 2020 wildfires. Do you think that he was correct to do that? Or should he have been looking to other sources and other processes?
Well, I think it was a very easy way to blame others rather than what actually could have the government done to also put real action to preserve ecosystem and to limit the effect of wildfires. As an example, if you continue building big villas and buildings in fire-prone ecosystems,
California wildfires,
then
President
it's
Trump
very important to consider that you will have a risk on that. in building in such fire-prone ecosystems. So I will not blame too much the forest managers, but yeah.
Thank you very much. I was just replying. What a good question that was, and somehow managed to trigger the audio of the video at the same time. It would be so unlike Donald Trump to try and shift blame though onto somebody else. Surely, Daniele, how unusual is that? But no, that was a great answer to that question. Thank you. Two more things before I let you go that I have, and of course, other people might have questions too. I mean, one, you talked about adaptation to fire, which I think is really fascinating in the way that trees, the lodgepole pine being a classic example, has evolved to work in sympathy with fire. And indeed, it almost requires fire as part of its kind of natural life cycle. To what extent does that happen in other species as well? Are there other plants and tree species that require fire in order to maintain their life cycle?
Yeah, there are many examples in plant communities, but there are also examples, for example, in fauna. There are certain species of birds who can nest really in those fire-prone environments. And who knows, maybe we are also, to some extent, a kind of fire-prone species, considering that East Africa is a classic example of fire-prone environment. So yeah, there are many examples there of species that are very much adapted to fire, but also other species that are very much sensitive to fire. So species in a setting that where fire maybe is not very common, and so if you introduce artificially fire in those systems, you will expect actually that those species may even reduce or disappear. So we have examples also from the past.
Thanks, Daniele. And then finally, my final question, it's not so much about something that you were talking about in your talk, but I remember I was at a conference a few years ago and I sat down in the wrong conference panel. And I, as you sometimes do, I misread the timetable. And I sat down and to be honest, I was fascinated by a series of talks on something called Paleofire. But I have to say, I can't quite remember the full details of Paleofire. I seem to remember it's like historical fires, I think I'm right in saying, and the way that they can reveal something to us about past climates and perhaps can even help us to reconstruct past climate. Can you just give us an insight into that branch of geography and geographical research?
Yeah, I think, as you say, this is very much also kind of geographical view, geographical perspective, in the sense that you bring in the temporal perspective to understand the processes that are occurring today and possibly also in the future. So under the Paleofire let's say field is all those studies which try to understanding the variability of fire in the past related to different drivers like climate, but also prehistoric people, and try to learn some lessons for managing today ecosystems, but also to imagine how our future world would look like, at least in certain ecosystems, under more fire, for example.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's another of the many applications in geography. Just because you have this nice and interesting, double perspective of spatial and also space and time.
Well, that seems to be a perfect way to draw this Q&A to an end. We have moved through time and we have moved through space. You've taken us on a world tour from Australia to Africa to Europe and to the west coast of America, and you've taken us back tens of thousands of years and right up to the present day as well. Daniele, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know that you have had an extremely busy day of teaching today and that you have a busy week ahead of you, so we really appreciate you giving up your time to speak to us. If I can just ask you to hold on there for just a second, because what I also want to do is just to show the people at home the next session that we have coming up. So on the 8th of March 2021 at 5 p.m, we will have a lecture from Professor Catherine Brickell, who will be talking about her amazing research on something called the Blood Bricks Project, which involves untold stories of modern slavery and climate change from Cambodia. Catherine and her team have been following the production of the bricks that you can see on the screen in front of you, and looks at the broader economies and ecologies of brick production in Cambodia. And Catherine's project won the, I think it was the Times Higher Academic Project of the Year in 2020. It's an absolutely brilliant piece of work that links together fantastic geographical scholarship along with really policy relevant implications. So that will be on the 8th of March, and then we'll do the live Q&A the week after. And Daniele, thank you again for this evening. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening. And thanks everyone.
And great engagement from viewers at home. Rob is saying thank you on behalf of him and the pupils and students that he's sharing this with. So Rob, thanks so much for joining us as well, and to everyone else watching from home. To teachers and to pupils alike, all of this material, all of these Q&As, all of the lectures are going to be on our Teachers Hub. They already are in many cases on our Teachers Hub on the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway website. So please do engage with those materials. They're there to be helpful for you. And again, teachers, if you have any special requests, if you'd like us to cover particular areas in more depth or more detail, let us know, and we'd be happy to work with you to make sure that we're hitting the areas of geography that you would like to have covered. So I'm going to finish off just by sharing with you this slide with all of the details of the Teacher Hub, and I look forward to seeing you again on the 8th of March. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Bye-bye.